Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. and I'm the host of Reformed GGA, this channel. And today I'm here to do the next video on the series on my multi-role rifle. This guy right here. It is a Palmetto State Armory AK-47 GF3 that I've added some doodads and whatnot to. And in this series I've basically just been explaining my thought process and why I picked this gun, why I picked this caliber, why I picked the doodads and whatnot that I put on it. That's been the thing, just to give people who are perhaps new to guns and new to setting up rifles some things to think about. I'm not saying that this is necessarily the best gun for everybody. I'm just giving people the thought process behind it so that they can make adjustments for their own situation, hopefully. In the first video, I talked about my purposes. What is it that I want this thing to do? And I laid out 4 things that this gun had to be able to do. It needed to be a gun that was plinkable in 2020 for a wide variety of people. That was a relatively difficult challenge. 2, it is something that had to be capable as a bedside self-defense type gun. 3, it is something that needed to be capable of being used as a hunting gun for relatively large animals, like say something in the size range of say a deer or something like that. And then on top of that, it also needed to be, the 4th thing, it also needed to be something that would be capable of dealing with a mob type situation. I've explained in previous videos that if a mob were to form in my town or whatnot, my primary goal would be to escape, to get out of the area. But unfortunately, weird things happen, and you never know exactly what's going to happen, so it doesn't hurt to be prepared. Alright, so those were the goals that I laid out, and in the first video I went into those in quite a bit more detail. In the second video, I said, okay, now that I have the goals in mind, let's pick a caliber that's going to fulfill all those goals, and I wound up with 7.62 by 39. There were other candidates that were out there, but for the particular things that I wanted it to do, especially being plinkable in 2020, relatively low cost, but also hard enough hitting to take down something, say, the size of a deer or something like that. You know, I didn't want to go too light with, say, 5.56 or something like that, or, you know, rimfire or something like that. So that's between cost considerations and power considerations, 7.62 by 39 wound up being the practical option. And then after I discussed what caliber, I said, okay, what are we going to put that caliber in? Where are we going to put that bullet in? And there are lots of options that are on the table, but when you consider the fact that this is 2020, gun availability is kind of down, and then also I want something that could be used a little bit more dynamically, something with, you know, detachable box magazines and things like that. It has to be available, it has to be at a price I can afford. Eventually I wound up saying, well, I wound up with a Palmetto State Armory because they're available, they're relatively low cost, has detachable box magazines so that, and fairly large capacity detachable box magazines so that, you know, like I said, that mob situation, home defense situation, even general plinking is more fun with more rounds, provided you can afford them, which in 2020 is a little iffy. All of that goes into it, of course. And that's basically why I wound up with the AK-47 from Palmetto State Armory. It was available, it was the right price, it had the right cartridge, and it could hold a fairly large capacity in detachable box magazines. One thing that I didn't talk about, though, is why I went with a full-size AK. Because that thing has a 16.3-inch barrel on it, like pretty much all standard AKs do. But of course, on the market today, and even from Palmetto State Armory, there are things like this that are out there. This is a 10.5-inch version. It is virtually identical to the other one that I showed you, at least as far as the core components of the gun, except the front end is just a little bit different. Obviously, it's shorter, has a little booster on the end instead of a brake. The piston that is inside the gas tube up here is a little bit shorter, but the rest of the gun is basically standard AK. And because this is a short gun, it is this one is legally a pistol, and so it has a pistol brace on the end instead of a stock. But otherwise, it's basically just like its big brother. It's just smaller. And a lot of people, when they would think of multi-role guns, they would gravitate towards something that is smaller, and it is also lighter. When this thing is fully kitted out with optic, with a light on it, I don't have a light on it right now, but with a light on it, it winds up being like 12 to 14 ounces lighter than the full-size version. And part of that is because some of the equipment is a little bit different. This optic, for example, is a lighter optic, and it also doesn't have as much magnification as the other one does. There are little things like that, but on the whole, it is lighter, and it is very obviously smaller. And that would attract a lot of people to these things. So why didn't I pick that for my multi-role gun? It's smaller, it's lighter. Why not go with this? Well, the basic reason is that even though it is smaller and lighter, and in all the things that I talked about, all the roles that I wanted to fill, those things are generally good for plinking. Having something that is smaller and lighter means that more people will be able to shoot it more comfortably, just on those merits alone. If it's smaller, a bit more compact, it's easier to throw in a case. You don't need as big of a case for it, things like that. So it's a little bit easier to transport. It is physically lighter, so lighter framed people will be able to, hold it up a little bit more easily. One of the problems with the full-size AK is that the barrel is fairly long and heavy, and lighter framed people that maybe don't have as much upper body strength have a hard time holding that barrel up for prolonged periods of time. With a shorter barrel like this, it's not as much of an issue. Okay, it's an AK, there's still going to be some weight there. This thing is still about 7.5 pounds, so it's not like it's the lightest thing ever. But compared to something that's more like 8.5 pounds, the other one is a little under 8. No, it's a little past, and this one's, anyways, yeah. But roughly, 3/4 to a pound lighter. It does make a difference in that sense. So it's better for plinking. Home defense, a little bit shorter on the front end. You can fit through doors a little bit more easily. Most standard interior doors are going to be for main passageways, at least not side doors and closets and stuff like that, but main passage doors are usually about 32 inches wide. And this thing, with the brace fully extended with the booster on it, I think it comes in at like, I think it's 31 inches, so it gives you 1/2 inch on either side, and usually you wouldn't come, through a door like this, you wouldn't come with it perfectly perpendicular. You'd come with it out a little bit, and it'd be a little easier to get through the doors and whatnot with it. So it would be a little bit better for the bedside self-defense role in that regard. It's easier to maneuver through the house with. In terms of hunting, if you're out there hunting for a while, and some people when they hunt, they traverse quite a bit of land. Sometimes they'll go 15 miles before they find the animal that they're trying to hunt. Having something that's smaller and lighter can definitely pay off. If you told a hunter, hey, we'll give you the gun you have now, except we're going to take a full pound of weight off, or 3/4 of a pound of weight off, would you be interested in that? And they're going to say yes, at least depending on what the cost difference is. But generally, yeah, smaller and lighter is by itself a good thing. And then last but not least, that whole applicability, what happens if you get stuck in a violent mob? Well, again, it's a little bit shorter, a little bit lighter, so it's going to be easier to wield. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Be able to use it a little bit more dynamically, not a bad thing. So on the surface of it, it looks like a 10.5 inch AK really does seem like it would fit my roles better. But that's only looking at the positives of it being shorter and lighter. There are some very distinct disadvantages to having a short AK though, and those disadvantages are the reason why I wound up not picking one of these for my multi-role gun. I'm obviously not opposed to owning one and having one and using it for other roles, but not necessarily my multi-role gun. It might be good in a few of the roles, but I don't feel that it's very good in all of them because there are some distinct disadvantages that guns like this have. One of the disadvantages is that they generally have increased recoil. It's the same size cartridge as fits in the big one, but it's put in a smaller gun. So same size cartridge, more or less the same size explosion. The barrel length can affect that a little bit too, but for all intents and purposes, more or less the same size explosion. Same amount of force that is there, basically, but there's less for it to push against, there's less to resistance, so the result is more felt recoil. And on top of that, this AK, like a lot of short AKs, can have some reliability issues, and the way that a lot of designers have gotten around that is by putting these things on the end. This is not a normal muzzle device, this is called a booster. And what it does is it allows the gases from the fired round to expand a little bit more, and it creates extra back pressure to make sure that the gun cycles correctly. So in a way, it actually increases the recoil impulse. So it's a lighter gun, so you're going to feel more recoil because of that, but it increases, the system is designed to increase back pressure, which creates even more of an issue in terms of recoil. So for example, my first roll, being plinkable in 2020 by a wide variety of people, well, yeah, it's smaller and lighter, so handier for a lot of people, but once they go to shoot it, if it's a small person who's trying to shoot the small light gun, well, it has even more recoil than the big one. It's going to be really uncontrollable. Yay, I can hold it up for a good period of time, but as soon as I start shooting it, it's going to start bouncing all over the place, and it's going to push the lighter person around. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there are some people that I go shooting with that are literally only 8 years old. Obviously, there's parental supervision and those kinds of things, but I go shooting with people that are fairly young and fairly old, and they don't like being pushed around that much. And so these kinds of guns, while they're fairly fun for me and for a lot of people, when you start getting towards the ends of the bell curve on the population dynamics, it's not as fun. When you're talking about small, young people or frail, older people, guns like this are not very much fun anymore. So in that and as far as being plinkable in 2020 for a wide variety of people, that whole wide variety of people thing, because of the recoil issues, become a little bit of a problem. Another issue with these things, because they have a shorter barrel on them, they tend to have more blast. Tends to make an even louder sound, and if I'm talking about, say, a home defense scenario, a bedside gun, well, firing a rifle indoors is already going to be really hard on your ears. Firing a short barrel rifle indoors is going to be extremely hard on your ears. Now, if I have to make the decision between, saving my life or risking some hearing damage, I'm going to pick saving my life, obviously. But it is more manageable to deal with a full-length rifle because they don't have as much blast, because more of the propellant gets burned up inside of the barrel rather than outside. It's going to be a little bit more manageable with a full-length barrel than not. Now, of course, this can be mitigated by putting, a suppressor on the end of the gun or something like that, but that's more time and expense. Do you have that time and expense, etc., etc.? It's not that it's not entirely mitigatable, but this is 2020. Having something on hand that's handy that I don't have to get other things for down the line is kind of preferable. So, again, plinkable in 2020, yes. Wide variety of people because of the added recoil, not so much. Does it work as a bedside gun? It's light, it's small, it's handy. You can get around the corners with it nice and good. But there's a lot of extra blast. It's going to be harder on the ears. And I don't have a silencer for it, so kind of not as great. The other gun, yes, is longer, so it's not going to be as maneuverable. But if you're working in an environment that you're familiar with and you actually practice and you train, a gun that's a little bit longer, and we're only talking 5 to 6 inches here, a 10.5 inch barrel versus a 16.3 inch barrel. Now the length of the muzzle devices changes things a little bit. That's why I'm saying 5.5 to 6 inches, because it doesn't perfectly come across because you have different muzzle devices, so that messes with a little bit. I'm not talking about a ton of difference there. And so in terms of maneuverability, getting around corners, if you spend a little bit of time training, if you actually practice in the environment in which you think you might have to use it, etc., etc., it's not that big of a deal. Is it an advantage to have a small light gun in tight spaces? Of course it is. But the bigger ones are not unsuitable, and if you factor in the greater blast that these things have, yeah, like I said, it can be downright unpleasant. And if you're someone that is fairly hearing sensitive, and you are fairly sure that it would be very disorienting for you to fire a gun in a small confined space. That would be really distracting for you. That's something to keep in mind. You don't want to be distracted when you're trying to defend your life. So is it something that is, like I said, an absolute? No. If it came down to me firing a gun that's less than ideal in a confined space versus saving my life, I'm going to pick saving my life. But it is still not as ideal in a confined space because of the added blast. And then in the issue of hunting. When you're, like I said in my earlier videos, I want to be able to hunt out to 200 yards. And at 200 yards, the full-size AK, let me go ahead and bring it out here. At 200 yards, the full-size AK has a kinetic energy with its round of around 870 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. That's kind of in the realm of somewhere between a 10 millimeter and a 44 Magnum, kind of a light 44 Magnum, a somewhat hot 10 millimeter. And those are not overly fantastically great powerful rounds, but a lot of people do use them for hunting, and they use them for hunting quite successfully. And so even out to 200 yards, although it's not going to be as powerful as a lot of other rifle cartridges, like say 30-06 or something like that, it's still going to be powerful enough to be able to do the job with relatively large game. Like I said, something the size of a deer or something thereabouts, 870 foot-pounds of kinetic energy will get the job done. It might not be great, it might not be as good as other cartridges that are out there, but it's pretty potent. Now, the 10.5-inch AK, at 200 yards, it can reach that. It's ballistically capable, and depending on the particular gun that you're talking about, the accuracy can be decent enough to get that kind of a shot. The problem, though, is that the shorter the barrel of the gun, the less efficient your powder burn is going to be. You're going to have some powder that winds up burning outside of the barrel. That's what I talked about with the increased blasting. It doesn't all burn in the barrel like it's supposed to, and so some of it burns outside of the barrel, and it's not going to be pushing on the bullets at that point anymore. It just basically explodes in the open air. And so it's not as efficient, which means the bullet is not going to be leaving the barrel as fast with a shorter barrel. And in the case of this particular one, the stats on it, and there's different videos out there of people who have done velocity testing on them, and there's lots of ballistic calculators that are out there that you can use to extrapolate out to whatever distance you want. And doing that using other people's data, as well as looking at some of the ballistic calculators that are available online. This one at at 80 yards gets to that 870 foot-pounds of kinetic energy that I was talking about earlier. Same number of foot-pounds, but the issue is the distance. This one, I start falling below that measure at only 80 yards. The full-size one has 870 foot-pounds of kinetic energy all the way out at 200 yards. So like I said, the full-size one hits about as hard as a 10 millimeter 44 Magnum, somewhere in there at 200 yards. This one does hit that hard, but all the way back at 80 yards. By the time you get out to 200 yards, it's not really all that more powerful than a 357 Magnum handgun, or maybe a really hot 40 caliber handgun. It's significantly lower initial velocity means that your kinetic energies as you go out are also going to be significantly lower. And something that is basically in the realm of more or less a normal handgun at 200 yards is not going to be as effective as taking down large game. Now, it can be done. People have hunted fairly large game with handguns, even 357 Magnum handguns, and that's what this thing would be equivalent to, basically all the way out at 200 yards. It can be done, but again, it's not as effective. And another issue, because you have such a low starting velocity, is your bullet is going to tend to drop faster, which means to get the bullet to the target, it's going to have to kind of lob in a little bit, which means you're going to have more holdover that you need to do in order to get an accurate shot on target. So for the hunting application, you're not going to have as much power at range, and also it's going to be a little bit harder to figure out exactly where you need to hold because it drops faster. And because of that, it's not going to be ideal for hunting all the way out to 200 yards, at least by comparison. Can you get hits at 200 yards on fairly large game with something like this that would be effective enough to bring it down so that you have something to eat? Yes, there are people that have done it. But by comparison, which one is it going to be easier to get that shot, and which one is going to be more effective at taking the animal down? The longer barrel version is. Faster velocity to start with means a little bit flatter trajectory, so you don't have to worry about your holdovers as much. And also it's going to have more kinetic energy when it gets there, so it's going to more reliably take down the animal you want. This thing, it's not going to be great for that. Like I said, the comparison is about 80 yards for this little thing compared to 200 for the big one in terms of having an even playing field in terms of kinetic energy. 80 yards versus 200 is a pretty big difference in order of balancing out kinetic energies. Not great. And then the final role is that of being operable in a mob. In that one, I actually think that this thing might be okay, because in a mob type situation where you would be actually worried enough to start, having to shoot to defend yourself, it's probably going to be relatively close, so some of those distance issues are probably not going to be as big of an issue. And the smaller gun will make it a little bit more maneuverable in that situation and whatnot. So for a mob type situation, a shorter, lighter gun might actually be a real true advantage. But like I said, the other three areas it kind of fails in. It's more recoil, so it's not going to be fun for a wide variety of people to shoot. It has a lot more blast to it, so using it in a confined space as a bedside gun, not as ideal for that. It doesn't have as much ballistic oomph, and so it's not going to be as useful for hunting out to 200 yards. But for the possibility of having to deal with a mob type situation, you don't necessarily need something that's effective at range, because if it's a mob and you're actually at a point where you're worried about them, they're probably pretty close. And the added blast and recoil and those kinds of things, if it's me that's shooting it, just suck it up and deal with it in the moment. In a mob, I'm hoping that, it's not going to be an 8-year-old kid defending me. Hopefully I'm the one who's defending the 8-year-old kid, if anything. So a lot of those other issues kind of go by the wayside. That is, out of the 4 roles that I picked for my multi-role gun, that's the one that I think a short-barreled AK would probably be the best in, and the most defendable is using this over the long version. But in all of the others, the other 3, the long version has some distinct advantages. It's lighter recoiling. It is something that's just a little bit quieter, and it has a greater effective range, especially in terms of muzzle energy and bullet drop or lack thereof. So that is the reason why I went with a 16.3-inch barreled AK instead of the 10.5-inch barreled AK. Does that mean that the 10.5-inch AK or comparable other short guns, whether they be AR platform, etc., couldn't work at all as a multi-role gun? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that for the roles that I picked and for the concerns that I have, the long version is a little bit better for those concerns. I'm not saying that it's best for you, but I am saying that this is stuff to think about. Alright, that's all that I had. Thank you all for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.